afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the poll, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Assisting Girls at Risk of Female Genital Mutilation Cutting, What Child Abuse Professionals Need to Know. My name is Carissa Rano, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I'd like a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those of you wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. The certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect Thank You email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Steffi Rapp from OJJDP.
Hello, everyone. My name is Steffi Rapp, and I'm a Juvenile Justice Specialist at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. On behalf of OJJDP, I want to thank my colleagues from the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section at the Department of Justice for co-hosting this webinar today. I would also like to thank our presenters for taking the time to share valuable information on this important topic. We will first hear from Ms. Kathleen O'Connor. Ms. O'Connor serves as a career prosecutor for the Department of Justice. She began her career as an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., where she served as legal counsel in over 50 criminal trials. She has served in many management positions, and in 2012, the Criminal Division at the Department of Justice appointed Ms. O'Connor to Deputy Chief of the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section, where she supervises criminal prosecutions of human rights violators. She also serves as the department's coordinator for the President's Atrocities Prevention Initiative. We will then hear from Dr. Andrea Green. Since 2004, Dr. Green has worked at the University of Vermont Children's Hospital Pediatric Primary Care Practice in Burlington, Vermont. There she is the director of the Pediatric New American Clinic and Associate Professor of Pediatrics. Since 2006, her practice solely cares for refugee children from Burma, Bhutan, Iraq, and many African nations. In 2009, she received a Special Achievement Award from the American Academy of Pediatrics in recognition for her work with refugee children. Next, we will hear from Zainab Iega. Ms. Iega is the Executive Director of Saudi Yetu Center for African Women and Families, a community-based social service organization based in the South Bronx of New York. Ms. Iega manages the day-to-day functioning of the organization as well as guiding its strategic direction. Ms. Iega has facilitated numerous cross-cultural competency trainings on domestic violence, sexual assault, and sexual and reproductive health for service providers, and provided technical assistance to immigrant and refugee organizations. Finally, we will hear from Suzanne Lima. Ms. Lima joined the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Human Rights Law Section and Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Center in November 2011 as the Associate Legal Advisor covering the West and Central Africa case portfolios. We'd also like to mention that this webinar is available for download, and anyone who will use the discussion or comments or webinar itself, please contact Susan Masling at susan.masling@usdoj.gov. Thank you. We will now hear from Kathleen O'Connor.
Thanks very much, Steffi, and thanks to OJJDP for hosting this webinar. Thank you to my fellow panelists, Zainab and Andrea and Suzanne, for joining me in promoting this discussion about a very, very important topic, female genital mutilation / cutting. And thanks to all of you who are participating in this webinar for joining the discussion. We're here to present some information to you, but we're also looking forward to hearing from you and to hearing your questions or comments or experiences with this topic. The interagency, the United States government interagency, has been very active in preventing and responding to FGMC, and so we're going to give you a little bit of information about what we've been doing, what is FGMC, and then we're going to engage in a conversation with you. So let's get started and talk about what is FGMC. There are several definitions, and we'll talk about the legal definition in a minute, but this is the World Health Organization definition: any procedure that involves partial or total removal of external female genitalia or other injury to female genital organs, whether for cultural or non-therapeutic reasons. So let's talk a little bit about what is FGMC. You heard the World Health Organization definition, but how is it done? Who is it done to? Who performs it? Where is it done, and why is it done? Starting with how, there are different types of cutting and different levels of FGMC. Dr. Andrea Green is going to be discussing that in a minute. What are the methods for doing it? It differs. There's no one method or one way that FGMC is practiced. So, for example, the instruments used for the cutting can be medical instruments. It can be actually even a razor blade. It depends on who is doing it. It depends also on the country from which the persons come from, where it's occurring. Who does the cutting? That also varies depending on the actual procedure. For example, in Egypt, oftentimes it is done in a hospital setting. In other countries, it is done in a village by an elder woman. Generally, it is maternally driven. So mothers are mothers are bringing their daughters to have the procedure done. It's driven very much by females. And who is being cut? Again, this depends on the culture, it depends on the country, but anywhere from the age, from an infant, 0 years of age, to up to 17 years of age. So again, it depends. And then why is it done? This too varies depending on country, depending on culture. It's important to know that there is no basis in religion, so the practice predates both Islam and Christianity. And in fact, recently many religious leaders have come out and spoken out against it and made it clear that, in fact, it is not a requirement of any religion, and it has no basis in religion. Why is it done? Again, it generally is maternally driven, and generally mothers who are subjecting their daughters to this procedure are doing it for what they consider to be a beneficial reason. So they believe that this helps the young girl become marriageable. They believe that it's done for health reasons. So it's not done for negative or retributive reasons. It's done to help the girl in their minds. The good news is that this procedure is declining in prevalence, but this slide shows you generally where the practice occurs throughout the world. So we can see that A large populations in Africa are subjected to the procedure. It also occurs in India, Indonesia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. The first criminal trial that occurred with a conviction for cutters happened in Australia, so it's happening in Australia. We've recently heard that in Colombia, South America, there are individuals who are subjected to it. So it clearly is worldwide, and even though the numbers are decreasing in prevalence worldwide, which is a good thing, we see on the next slide that the numbers in the United States are actually on the rise. And that's because the numbers of persons immigrating to the United States from countries where the cutting occurs are on the increase. So worldwide the numbers are going down, but the numbers of women and girls at risk in the U.S. are on the increase, which is another reason why it's important for you to understand what FGM is and how it impacts the United States. When we say the number of girls who are at risk of FGM in the United States, this is a number that comes from the CDC, and that number is on the rise. Recently, the CDC estimated the number of girls and women who are at risk of FGMC here in the United States is 500,000 strong. That number is an estimate, and it's based on extrapolated information. That is, how many women from those countries that practice it have come here. And it's important to note also that that 500,000 number includes not only girls who are at risk of being cut, but women who have been cut. So that number is an estimate, and one of the reasons that we're reaching out to you is we want information from you as to whether or not you all have been hearing about it, receiving reports about it, coming into contact with it. Is cutting happening here in the United States? The answer is we have received allegations that in fact it is happening, and certainly in terms of girls being taken overseas for the purpose of being cut, we've also had allegations about that as well. But again, we need your help in understanding more what the parameters are of that, the impact of it here in the U.S. So as we're talking, we like to hear from you on the chat about whether you've received reports. If you have received reports, what have you done with those? In your state, is there a code for FGMC? So if you were to report, how would it be coded? All that information is what we'd like to hear from you today. So where these women and girls are located, there's 5 metropolitan areas in the United States, including New York, LA, DC, Seattle, and Minneapolis. Those are the largest areas with the most women and girls at risk of FGMC. So if you live in these areas, you're more likely to have that effect. It's affecting your regions. And we're reaching out broadly to Child Protective Services in these metropolitan regions to raise awareness. We're going to talk about the law here. And the reason we're talking about the law is because it's important to understand what FGMC is in terms of the legal framework. This does not suggest that we think that we're going to prosecute our way out of this issue. In fact, the anticipation of prosecutions is rather low. But it is important to know what the law is, and our primary goal in bringing this to your attention is to ask for your assistance in helping to prevent FGMC here in the United States. There is a federal law, however, which was enacted by Congress in 1996, which makes it illegal to perform FGMC on girls under the age of 18 years old. And the legal definition is whoever knowingly circumcises, excises, or infibulates the whole or any part of the labia majora or labia minora or clitoris, unless medically necessary, is performing a criminal act. The idea that it is required, the reason that it's being performed is because it's required due to custom or ritual, is irrelevant to criminal liability. So if someone is performing FGMC because they believe that it's required for religious reasons or customary reasons or ritual, that is irrelevant to the statute. The statute brings a felony charge and has a 5-year penalty associated with it. In 2013, Congress amended the statute to include a provision which makes it also illegal to transport from the United States and its territories a person for the purposes of FGMC. This amendment also makes it illegal for anyone to assist in the transport. So, for example, if someone were to buy a plane ticket for a girl so that they are transported overseas for the purpose of FGMC, the person buying the ticket is also criminally liable. Again, this is a felony and has a 5-year penalty. In addition to the federal law, there are 23 states which specifically criminalize FGMC. In those states which do not have an FGM criminal statute, the child abuse laws apply. Because FGMC is, in fact, child abuse. Child abuse is punishable in every state, and every state requires mandatory reporting for child abuse. The next slide shows those states which have criminalized FGMC, and it's important to look at those state laws because some states actually criminalize the practice regardless of age. So, for example, in Illinois, regardless of the age of the female, FGMC is illegal. Other states require mandatory reporting of FGMC, that's Tennessee and Illinois. And some states, those states that you'll see with the asterisk associated with them, also make it a crime to take the girl out of the U.S. for purposes of FGMC. So there's both federal laws and some state laws, but certainly the child abuse laws are relevant and criminalize the practice of FGMC here in the United States. And I think that's it for me right now. Andrea?
My turn. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for listening in today. And I'm going to bring you the perspective as a pediatrician who works with immigrant community here in Vermont, not one of the big states, but we are a federal resettlement site. And so we've had numerous different refugee groups coming in. And in general, the refugee groups I deal with who have had FGMC tend to be the Somali and the Somali Bantu communities, some of the Sudanese. So getting, again, to the World Health Organization definition of female genital mutilation and cutting, there are 4 classifications that are described depending on what has been done to the woman or child. And type 1 of FGMC is a partial or total removal of the clitoris and or prepus, so it's called a clitorectomy. Type 2 is the clitorectomy plus excision of part or all of the labia minora and maybe some of the labia majora, but not always. Type 3 is a narrowing of the vaginal orifice with the creation of a covering seal by cutting and pulling together the labia minora and or the labia majora with or without excision of the clitoris, and that's what is called infibulation. And class 4 is any other kind of injury to the genital area, and includes pricking, piercing, stretching, burning, scraping, or other manipulation of the external genitalia. And in appearance, type 1 will just have that clitorectomy, and then type 2, you can see in this picture, has the removal of often the labia minora and maybe a bit of the labia majora, and then type 3 can have removal of the whole area, and then it can be approximated again, and that can be done with sutures, or it can be done with thorns or other things to pull those parts together. The prevalence can vary again, but it's thought to be that only about 15% are the type 3 infibulation when we're looking at young people who have had this done. Type 3 is often what we talk the most about because it has the severe outcomes. In my population, in general, I see type 1, type 2, and type 4, and I have not seen a lot of type 3. So what are the complications from having this kind of procedure done? So early on, the complications can be anything from minor to severe. There may be things like infection, or if that infection progresses, it may lead to sepsis, especially if tools that are being used are used between patients without good cleaning, or are things like razor blades or pieces of glass or other sharp objects. Again, if a child hasn't been immunized, that can result in them also getting tetanus. Some people will experience some minor bleeding, but that bleeding can be more extensive if other larger vessels are affected, and people do die from hypovolemic shock at times. People can experience urinary retention, obviously because of the pain, and often after the procedure, the child's legs are bound together. And again, those high rates of complications are seen in type 2 and type 3. Late complications can again vary, more common again in type 2 and type 3 genital mutilation. But in general, you can see problems in the area of urinary issues, so recurrent urinary tract infections or pyelonephritis, infections of the kidneys, a lot of dysfunctional voiding. You can also see scarring that can happen in that there can be cysts or there can be keloids, and keloids are sort of a overgrowth of tissue in the area. People can develop abscesses, or they can have difficulty with hematocolpus, which is the extruding of the menses when they have their period. People experience pain with intercourse. They can have vulvar and vaginal pain. They can have neuromas. Sometimes clitoral neuromas will develop, and they can have pain with their periods that's increased. They can have issues with infertility due to lack of sexual desire, due to infibulation and the fact that it can be difficult for vaginal penetration, and they can have pelvic scarring that can occur because of infection leading to pelvic inflammatory disease, and that can cause fertility issues. There's also increased incidence of yeast infections, of bacterial vaginosis, and of herpes simplex virus, and theoretically there's a risk of increased HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C, although there's no clear evidence for that. Psychological complications can occur. There's not a lot of research in this area, but and I would say that it's difficult to know because a lot of the people who have experienced this have also experienced other forms of trauma, whether pre-flight or during resettlement or when they're in refugee camps or other types of situations. Often, especially with children, they have parents who are traumatized, and traumatized parents cause traumatized children. But definitely there have been thoughts, and in some articles, most of them have not had good controls, but in some articles there's the suggestion of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and somatization, which is the experiencing of psychological pain in a physical way, like with back pain or chronic stomach pain. So what are some of the challenges in caring for women and girls affected by FGMC? I think that part of why we're having this whole discussion is that often people don't know an awful lot about it. There's not a lot of training. It's not something that people are taught. So a lot of people approach this without really understanding it well. It also can be very difficult to understand what type of FGMC people have had, especially in prepubescent girls. It cannot necessarily be clinically apparent on exam, especially with type 4. The majority of my patients tell me that their children were circumcised by type 4. Usually it's a little slit that's made in the clitoris, and so on physical exam, often I don't see anything at all. It also can be difficult to perform a physical exam. People are trying to create relationship, and often for issues of modesty or sort of comfort level, even on the part of a provider, a genital exam may not be done, and so people may not see it because they're not looking for it. There also can be issues about how to sort of bring it up, how to do counseling and education in a culturally sensitive manner. However, studies have shown that most women do appreciate if their physician brings it up in a proactive way and are open to discussing it. So in discussing it with patients, I wanted to just run through some ideas that I have used to help bring it up with different families. I do domestic health exams and green card exams. So those are two opportunities for me to do a genital exam where it's really required as part of the exam, and I can use the fact that it is a required piece to allow that examination to happen. When I meet a family for the first time, I ask in my basic history about circumcision, and I ask it whether it's a male patient or a female patient. I ask it as part of their surgical history, and I also ask it as part of the family history so I can know whether or not a parent has been circumcised. We also will ask at that time at what age they were circumcised and how it was done and whom it was done by. Then when we're asking about the social context, we can get an idea of what the family, if it was done as sort of someone coming through the refugee camp or through the village who happened to be there, and so everybody was done at that time, and whether or not it was more of a community event, whether or not the family has talked to their daughters about this. Often what I find is when I talk to a family and ask about circumcision, the children will say, "What is that?" They do not know, and they do not remember that they were circumcised. When asking about beliefs, you can explore at this time sort of ideas about whether or not they think it was good or what was good about being circumcised, what they think is bad about being circumcised, whether or not they feel that this was something that was done because it was required by religion or whether it was required by culture. And that gives the opportunity to usually have me be able to say something about how it is more of probably a pharaonic tradition than, and that we know it is not part of Islam or Christianity. Then you can ask about what problems maybe the mother or the child has experienced as a result of having been circumcised, whether or not they're having any medical problems, such as those described previously with urinary issues, infectious issues, pain issues. You can also ask then at that time whether or not they've received any treatment for any problems, and then explore their thoughts on any future children, or if they have younger children, what they feel should be happening to that child, whether they were hoping that child be circumcised, and help them to understand that it is illegal here. I've had numerous people tell me when the birth of their first child in the United States that they want to have that child circumcised, whether it's a girl or a boy, and they understand that it happens in the nursery. And this usually allows us to have a conversation about the fact that we circumcise boys in the nursery, but it's illegal to circumcise girls in the nursery. And then usually we can talk about the few benefits there are to male circumcision and the fact that they're only perceived in our culture harms, and medically that there are only harms to being circumcised as a female. So some practical tips for caring for these communities. We recommend obviously using a trained interpreter. And I think what I've tried to do is to acknowledge the fact that this has been part of people's culture, but now they're living in a country where it is not acceptable. We really work on building trust and relationships so that we can have these conversations and so that we can do them with the idea of wanting to listen to each other, to understand each other, and to build relationship. We want to make sure that we're educating families, and I found that when we talk about it and educate people, they're much more responsive to understanding that this is not allowed here. And again, to provide anticipatory guidance and reminders to families that when they are pregnant, their female children will not be circumcised and it is not permitted, and to remind people prior to traveling overseas when we're doing any sort of travel immunizations that circumcision is not allowed for their female children. And then to talk about what the parents' fears or concerns are and why they are wanting their daughters to be circumcised. And usually this allows me to talk about things like sexuality in our media, about parenting, about American values around sexuality, about other ways that we can help to keep their daughters chaste, about community attitudes towards marriage, and some of these other things that we know, and whether or not people would like to continue those conversations as their children keep growing up, so that we continue to remind people that this is not allowed and why it's not allowed. And then I'm going to move on now to letting Zainab talk, and she will talk more about community outreach and education. But again, this is something that we do in our communities, especially around sexuality, because that tends to be where mothers have the most anxiety about not having had their daughters circumcised. Thank you very much.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Zainab?
Yes. Hello?
I hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry. You've heard a lot from Andrea and also from, Ms. Kathleen. They both have provided very broad and incredible information. So what I'm going to do is kind of bring it back. For those of you on the call who are not either working in a clinical setting or who are not working in a legal setting, but who are either working in the community or working with the clients, or even who are, within the child welfare, child protective services. So basically, what we can do is, if you get a call, for example, or there is an allegation or there is a report that a child might be at risk, what are the things that you need to do? Going back to Kathleen's map about the prevalence rates and the distribution of the countries and, communities where the practice is prevalent, the first question you need to ask either a caller is, what is the country of origin, for their family? Where do they come from? Or what is their ethnicity? So, for example, most people, when you talk to them or they make, a report, usually they will say Africa, but they will not necessarily mention a country. So maybe if you're answering the phone, you can say, if then, Africa, which part? Is it East Africa, West Africa, or is it North Africa? So a country like Egypt usually is not, perceived to be on the continent of Africa because it's within that MENA region, which is Middle East, North Africa region. So people usually don't assume that Egypt is on the continent of Africa. So you need to find the ethnicity, the country of origin, as much information as possible. Then the second question you can ask is the number of children, especially female children within the household. And if that person is aware whether the children were born here, what are their ages, or whether they were born overseas. What is the language capacity? Is the family able to speak English, or do they speak French in the household? Or, what other languages do they speak? Of course, you presenting this operating on the idea that someone is calling and making a report. So you need to get as much background information as possible, because that information that you provide is then going to be used either by the service provider, whether it's a social worker, clinical social worker that you're referring a family to, or whether it's a child protective services that needs to have that background information, then to go into the household and do investigation. And as you saw the map, most people assume that the practice only occurs within the continent of Africa, and as Kathleen mentioned earlier, it is actually a global practice. For example, when people usually don't assume that certain subsect in India, Ismailis, practice perform this procedure, and the largest number of Ismailis outside of India is in Boston and then in Toronto. So if you're getting the call, you might be not take a call seriously because you might assume that, oh, it's not from the continent of Africa, therefore, let me not ask the detailed questions that I'm supposed to ask if it is a call regarding, let's say, a family from Guinea or a family from Mali or, let's say, even a family from Nigeria, right? So sometimes we don't really assume that this practice occurs in other communities. And as people who are working within the different social service sectors, you are the first people probably, who will be able to give permission for that family to say it is okay for you not to actually hold on into this practice, right? Because a lot of families are within, the social support network is within the community. And so sometimes people feel a little bit trapped if they want to step out and, do things differently. But if you're a child protective service provider or you're a lawyer or you're a social worker, you can create the space where this family can actually then begin to say, oh, it is okay for me not to no longer, adhere to these social norms and these social values. I can then say, actually, it is prohibited in the context where I am. And we've used that a lot with our families that we work with. We say, when families say, well, my family back home is harassing me about this. What can you help me, talk to them? And we usually say, yes, you can tell them that, it is against the law in this country. However, if you do something that is against the law, you could lose your children. And that fear of losing custody of their child and the child may be being placed in foster care acts as a deterrent and also acts as a way to tell the extended family back home, we can't continue to do this because we will lose our children. So again, as a social service provider or, child protective agency, you are the very first person who's going to be able to give this family or this individual who's coming to you, whether it's an adolescent girl or whether it's a mother, whether it is a child, who's going to be able to give that person the okay and the safety, to stand up to the extended family and to stand up to any parent within the home to say, I can't do that. So you have a very critical role to play, and you have a very important responsibility. So the way you hold that responsibility is also important in the safety and protection of the children within that household. All right. I think that's where I'm done, right? Yes. I think the next slide that I was going to talk about is about speaking with the young girls at risk. So in our experience in working in New York, the girls who are over the age of 10 to the age of 17, it's important that we create spaces for them to, express their feelings about this practice and be able to feel safe, and that whatever they share, is confidential enough. But we also learned that if the girls assume that their families are going to get into trouble by their disclosure, usually they're very reticent in sharing that information with you. So the biggest challenge for you as a service provider is what do you need to do to build that trust, as Andrea said, at the same time to create safe spaces where, that information can be disclosed, but the girls can also get support. One thing we've learned that, and in our experience we've known that has worked well for us, is that children under the age of 5, or under the age of 10, sorry, between 5 and 10, they're verbal. We know that if you ask them, they will tell you what's going on in the household. But because they're not very much aware about whether the parents will get into trouble or not. They're not at that conscious level to say, if I say something, my family will get into trouble. So usually it's a good, and parents know that, and parents who want, even on the continent in Africa, parents who want to continue to uphold the practice now are moving towards having their children circumcised younger, under the age of 5, because they know that under the age of 5 there's less resistance. But we also know under the age of 5, when a child is pre-verbal, it's going to be less likely for them to report, or when they go to daycare or kindergarten, or for them to be able to report because they're pre-verbal. But within the age of 5 and 10, if they go to kindergarten or preschool, they'll be able to tell if something happens to them that is painful, and this practice is painful. So we are always working within that age group to know that, and we tell the parents, if your child has something happens to your child, they're going to say what happens, whether they're in the school, whether they go to the clinic, whether whoever they interact with, if something happens that they don't like, they will tell. So we always educate the parents about that. But we've also learned that because we are within the community, sometimes community members don't feel comfortable, disclosing to us. So you as a provider, they might actually feel more comfortable coming to you than coming to us, because they know that you're not from the community. They know that you don't have any vested interest of the outcome of either way, but that you're there to support them and you're there to protect them, which is why your role is very important. And the way you manage that responsibility will then determine what happens next, and will determine how the family will continue to interact with you and will continue to disclose and share with you any other information, even if it's within the extended family. If you build a good trust, they'll be able to tell you that. I think that is it for my section. Hello? Hello?
Zainab, thank you. This is Suzanne. Thank you, Zainab, and the other speakers before me. I want to somewhat change gears, but also build on what others have been talking about as far as trust and prevention. And first talk about the immigration side of things, because as Kathleen mentioned, and also Dr. Andrea, that a lot of this is coming from immigrant communities, that this is very much a cultural tradition that is being brought from Africa, Middle East, and other parts of the world. And then I also want to talk about the accountability piece, really from a law enforcement perspective. So first on the immigration side, the primary case that we see is where someone has already been a victim of FGM, normally in their home country, and oftentimes from an African country. You can see from what Kathleen had talked about before, it's kind of in that middle belt of Africa, and that they can apply for asylum and be eligible for asylum on that basis. But they do have to show that they do subjectively fear it as persecution. So it kind of goes back to what we were saying as well about how do people view it? Are they going to continue to do this to their children? And what kinds of continuing complications do they have as a result of being cut? And then also you can see up there U visas. These are specific visas that someone can get to come to the United States and also become a lawful permanent resident. FGM is actually a specific crime that's mentioned in there. So if someone has been a victim in the United States or sent abroad from the United States, and that they help law enforcement to try and find and prosecute the case, then they can also be eligible for that U visa. And there's a few other potential immigration benefits as well, but asylum is really the number one that we normally see. And then on the opposite side of that are the immigration consequences for those who have been involved in subjecting someone else to FGM. So as Kathleen mentioned, someone who has bought a ticket for their daughter to travel overseas and be cut, someone who has actually held down girls' legs while they were cut, those persons would be considered a persecutor, and they would actually be barred from asylum. And then also if there's any involvement in persecution or involvement in FGM, whether directly or indirectly, there could also be negative discretionary findings depending on the type of immigration relief that's being sought, and potentially removal from the United States as well. So that's kind of the hard line that's taken is there's benefits for victims, and the United States really tries to be a haven for people who have been subjected to this, but at the same time take a hard stance at enforcing that that the people here are not involved in it, and that it doesn't become, as we've seen, kind of the cyclical nature, which is often involved in child abuse, but especially in FGM, as you've heard. And I'd also just add that there are some misconceptions. I think we talked about one, which is that if someone has had FGM subjected to them, that they necessarily view it as persecution, that they won't inflict it on their daughters, but actually it's a lot of the opposite. Because it's so culturally induced, because some people may be against it, but they're having, as Zainab talked about, a lot of pressure from their families to have it happen to their girls. Then because it's cyclical, it actually, we do see that there's a higher risk for girls who are from a culture, from an environment, from a family that have had this done. Also, there is sometimes a misperception that if a girl is in the United States, that she is necessarily safe, or that those who are at risk are actually foreign-born. But what we're also seeing is a lot of U.S. citizens born in the United States who are at risk of this as well, at risk of being cut here in the United States, and also at risk of being sent overseas as well. And also there is a sense, and especially when we talk about not just immigration, but then as I talk more about law enforcement, just this fear of, oh no, as soon as immigration finds out what happens, that their parents are going to be removed from the country, someone's going to get arrested, kind of these, the scary picture of law enforcement. But I think also what we tend to forget is how important law enforcement, just as an authority entity, can play a big role in preventing FGM from happening. And also, in a different context, but similar to what Andrew was talking about, play a role in just having conversations with persons who might be subjecting their daughter to this, to try to prevent it from happening, also to try to prevent it from happening to a second girl if it has already happened to the first girl. And so that kind of leads me to the next slide. One thing that we've talked about a little bit, and Kathleen had touched on, is as of 2013, it is a felony to send your daughter overseas to be mutilated. The problem there is it's, of course, very hard to catch. Once it happens overseas, it's also, from a law enforcement perspective, very hard to investigate. So what we have tried to do is implement a program where we prevent girls from going overseas who are at risk. The key part to that is that we need the information, and we need the really the lead information so that we can input that girl's name and date of birth, any other sisters she may have into our systems, working with Customs and Border Protection. And then if that girl does have an international ticket bought in her name, then she and primarily her family members traveling with her, or any other adult who's traveling with her, will be questioned at the airport, or if proper notification is given beforehand, then before they actually get to the airport. And we've seen some success already with this. it's still a very new initiative, but we have seen where a girl was actually, her mother was interviewed. She was a 7-year-old who was going to be sent back to Guinea by herself. We had received reliable information that she would be cut upon being sent back to Guinea, and when her mother was questioned, the mother admitted that no, she still fears that the daughter will be mutilated if she goes to Guinea, and so for that reason she wanted to actually take the daughter off the plane. So that was an example of where we're actually seeing that the prevention piece just by having someone talk to the family, just by having someone there and reminding the family or notifying them if they didn't know already that this is illegal, whether it's being done in the United States or abroad under both state and federal law, and that they can also have some pretty severe immigration consequences as well. And sometimes that by itself is enough to prevent someone from being sent overseas. But really, I think this is for everyone, is the information, getting the information to us is really key, which is, can you move to the next slide? Which is why I have this law enforcement contact information here. As you can see, and there I think are some folks from the Child Abuse Hotline who are in the audience. That is going to be the national hotline as of about October 1st, 2016. This is a child abuse hotline that is already been working for many years. They have translators, they have trained interviewers, and they can take calls, and they've been kind enough to take FGM calls. So that's going to be the main hotline that folks can use, whether it's for referrals, whether it's for law enforcement lead referrals, whether it's for someone who has already suffered and they need some kind of services, they're afraid, whether it's someone who's in academia who wants more information to do more research. It can just be a national hotline for that. So, and then under that is the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, our tip line. And I will mention as well, I'm part of the Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Center, and that center has the responsibility of investigating FGM cases from a federal level. It's not only U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Center, but also FBI is co-located there, Department of State as well, and other entities, and we work closely with Department of Justice's Human Rights and Special Prosecution section. So that is really kind of a good entity for contacting. If there's law enforcement in the audience who have any questions, you're welcome to contact us directly. And also I put up FBI's tip line on there because I know sometimes there are those concerns of if you contact ICE, then there'll be some kind of negative immigration consequences, or our legal authority doesn't allow us, legal authority under state law doesn't allow us to contact you. But FBI doesn't have those same issues, so feel free to contact them as well. And then Department of Justice's HRSP tip line is also there. Also, I've put on there just your local state police. They will have a child abuse section, or at least have some kind of knowledge, and some of you are in the audience as well. And state child protective services are going to be also another number to call. So some people are already on there. And I just got a notice that the number at the top is not correct, and we can make a change to that. It will be 1-800-4-A-CHILD, and you can also just look up the National Child Abuse Hotline and see what that is. But those are some of the really kind of key numbers to call. If you do have any concerns about someone traveling overseas, if you even just have questions about investigations, or you think that you know, a neighbor or a student might be sent overseas. We've also received tips from parents and family members, and maybe one parent agrees with it and one parent doesn't, and they're not sure what to do. So, so with that, I will turn it over to Steffi, and she's going to give some hypothetical case scenarios, which you all can think through, and then we'll give you our thoughts on them.
Thank you. Our first case scenario is a 5th grade teacher informs the principal of an elementary school that a 10-year-old girl of African descent might be at risk of female genital cutting. The principal calls the 800 number and reports that one of the students might be at risk of FGMC.
Zainab, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're the person on the call, on duty, you know, when the call comes through, what do you do and where do you start? I think the first question you can ask the person on the call is, it gives you a child of African descent, but it doesn't tell you the country of origin for the parents. So you need to ask where the parents are from, which country, which ethnicity, if that is possible, what is the language the family speaks at home, and, you know, does the caller know if any of the female members within the household, if they've been cut? Does the caller know if the child comes from a country where the prevalence rate of, you know, FGM, you know, female genital cutting is very high? For example, like a country like Guinea, or even a country like Egypt, where, you know, demographic health survey data, you know, of 2010 states that 97% of Egyptian women have been cut. So countries that have high prevalence rates, for example, if you're on the call, you can ask for those details, because the more information, questions you ask, the more information you get, the quicker it is for the Child Protective Services or even your local, you know, child welfare system to act immediately and to, you know, go into the house and, if need be, maybe take the child out of the house until, you know, investigation is taken care of.
Thank you, Zainab. The second question, and we're going to give the audience a little bit of time to think about it, and you can write up your answers on the screen, is you are the person on duty when the call comes through. What do you do? Where do you start?
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to enter your answers in the chat box. Okay, well, Zainab, you sort of answered this question already when we were talking about the first scenario, but do you want to just briefly describe, if you're the person on duty when you get a phone call, what would you do?
Yeah, if I'm a person on duty and, you know, I get the phone call, because I know the information I get is so critical for the safety of that child, and so I need to be, you know, and you only have maybe a few minutes, so I need to know, you know, the child's country of origin, age, you know, if, for example, if it's the principal, you know, does the principal know if the child has other, you know, siblings within the same school system? Are they older, are they younger? You know, does the principal know the safety of this child? You know, and does the principal know when the child is about to travel? You know, do they have an idea? Did the child mention, you know, to the teacher when they were, you know, traveling, or whether a ticket has been, you know, bought? So once I have that information, then I can write a summary up and contact my local, you know, Child Protective Services, or call the, you know, central registry, you know, for calling in child abuse and neglect cases, you know, and give that information to them, but also make sure that once I submit that information, I want to follow up in a couple of hours to make sure that the central registry or the Child Protective Services is taking action and making sure that that child is at least safe.
Thank you, Zainab.
So this is Andrea. I was just going to ask some, or sort of add one other thing. Sometimes schools have permission to talk to the child's physician. So if the school does have permission to talk to the child's physician, the physician may know if that child has been circumcised or not and have done an exam on that child. So that might also be useful information if they have the ability to and permission to reach out to the physician and find out some more of the medical information for that child.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you both, and thanks to all of you that have written in. I can see that you have great answers up on the screen as I'm reading them. Here are some other case scenarios. A family member or a friend calls and someone's talking about taking a child out of the United States for FGMC. Again, if you feel that you want to write your answers up in the chat room, please do. Suzanne, do you want to take this question?
Sure. I talked about it a little bit, but at least from an enforcement perspective, you can call the ICE tips line, and because we're within the same Homeland Security and we work with Customs and Border Protection, we can work on seeing that if the child actually is bought an international ticket, that the parents are interviewed or whoever travels with them is interviewed. It's also, I think, as probably Zainab and Andrea have talked about, better length. Important to get as much information as possible about who the person is who's calling, how they know this, as well as the information itself, the child, if they have names, where the child's from, if there's a language barrier, any of that kind of thing will really, the stronger the information, the more that we can do, the more that Child Protective Services can do as well. And Andrea and Zainab, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
No, I agree with what you're saying. And to piggyback on what Andrea said earlier, is also to get, if you can get all the medical records and to ensure that, you know, a child has not been cut, and then you can use that to engage with the families and tell them this child has not been cut, so, you know, to ensure that the child still maintains and stays safe.
I was going to say the other thing that happens for me is sometimes the rumors will pop up in the community, or I'll hear something, and then I just start telling everybody I see in the office and people I see out in the community, just a reminder. Just a reminder it's not allowed. Yeah. And the other thing I've had happen is young people asked to come in with their family to speak to me because their family is talking about this. And we have a call together, or sometimes we'll reach out to the elders. So there are different elder groups in our community, and we'll reach out and remind the elders and have a community-level conversation to help people. And the same thing that was discussed earlier about when Zainab was talking about reminding people it's against the law and having them use that to help with family members who are saying your daughter will never be able to get married, et cetera, et cetera. Often those family members out of the country and not knowing the laws here in the country. So we can do some counseling and some community engagement and reminders if we hear that these rumors are going on.
Thank you. And what if a family member or friend calls saying someone's talking about arranging to have a child cut in here in the United States?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, it's not a practice that is the norm in the U.S. It's also illegal, not only just the federal law, but also the child welfare laws in any of the states. You know, it's, as Kathleen said earlier, it's a form of child abuse. So I think the first question to ask is, who is the family member, you know, and who is that friend? How do they know this information? But also to find out where is it going to occur, and, you know, is it in a house, you know, in whose place, and kind of try to follow the thread of that information. And so in New York, what we've done is sometimes when we've got that call, in fact, we followed it through. A pediatrician got a call, not from the the communities that we worked with, but from a Southeast Asian community. They invited her. She'd been a pediatrician with them for a long time, and they said, we have this ceremony, can you come into the ceremony? And so she called us and said, I don't know what to do. Should I go? If something happens, what is my role and responsibility? And they said, well, the family heir trusts you, so you should use that as an opportunity. You should go into their home. If there's a ceremony, you should observe. And if you know something is going to happen to a child that is illegal, then you put a stop immediately and you call the authorities when you're there. But, in this case, it's saying that a family member friend says, but it doesn't tell you the details. So I think the first thing is to find out more details. Where is it, supposed to occur? Who is the family member? Who is the friend? Is there any more information about who are the people who are involved in this? And so if you're not quite sure how to handle it, I would say, you call the Child Protective Services, your local authorities, and, make the report and let them follow up.
And this is Suzanne. I would just add, too, that if there's any more information from that caller about who it is who's cutting the child, I think, as Zainab mentioned, that's really also a big concern because for us, we're especially looking at those who are cutting children in the United States and investigating those cases because they're not just doing it to one child, they're doing it to others. We've also received at least anecdotal information that sometimes it is doctors who are doing it and that it can be very costly as well. So it might have a monetary benefit for those who are doing it. So also not just looking at, the parent or whoever is talking about it, but also the practitioner in the community as well.
Thank you all. Our last case scenario, an FGMC victim calls and needs medical services or counseling. She was cut in her native country and she has a daughter.
I'll take that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, this is for someone who's been cut in their own country and needs counseling. Zainab, actually, you're much more able to speak about that one.
No, I think go ahead and then I'll piggyback on what you're saying since you already started.
So I just want to make it clear that there is no crime in the United States for cutting in a country overseas. So this, the law that we have as 18 U.S.C. 116 does not reach extraterritorially. So we could not, for example, bring a prosecution for someone who has been cut overseas. So clearly, a woman who has been cut overseas and here in the United States and has a daughter would raise a red flag for us as to making sure the daughter is not cut since we know that it is maternally driven. Zainab?
Yes, and then I would, say, if the person can tell you what is going on with them, so because they can say medical services, but that is very broad. So, what are you feeling? Can you tell me, any signs or symptoms you have? For example, for women, who are already cut already, so sometimes black skin develops keloids, right? So that you can ask if they have something that is swelling, a keloid-like that, because a lot of women might be afraid that that could be cancerous. So you can begin to ask them, what do they see? What do they feel like? Do they feel UTI, painful urination, painful menstruation? So to refer them to clinical services. For adult women, it could be obstetrics and gynecology or women's clinic. And then for adolescents or let's say prepubescent girls, because again, many of the girls are growing up, sometimes their body is changing, but then they notice at the age of 13, 14, 15 that they've been cut, and that's the first time they're beginning to, realize that their body looks different. So they might want to go to see adolescent clinician to help them, deal with what they've just been told. Sometimes families don't tell them. Sometimes, the child goes to well clinic and, the doctor discovers that they've been cut and tells the child. As for counseling, there's not a lot of counseling services available for victims of this practice. But I think any social worker who does a lot of therapy, who does a lot of counseling, especially around victims of sexual abuse or domestic violence, some of the tools used there can also apply for adult women and girls over the age of 15 who have been circumcised. And so also you can assess, you can ask the person, what is it that's going on with you? For example, do you sleep well? Or how many hours a night do you sleep? What are the things you enjoy doing? Are you able to do them? Do you feel sad often? Because you're also dealing with cultures where issues around, depression, mental health are not addressed. And sometimes people don't have the vocabulary to say that I'm depressed or I'm sad or I feel lonely or I feel angry. So by you actually having the victim tell you exactly what are the things they are feeling, then you can determine that they actually need counseling or they need talk therapy and maybe a little bit of, if they are going through clinical depression, then you might need to be able to help them get a psychiatrist who can actually give them some medication to modify the emotions until they're able to deal with, therapy. So it's up to you to ask the right questions and to be able to then refer them, to different services. What we do in New York is that when someone comes and says, I need medical services, I need to go see a doctor, which is usually what they say, and then once we refer them, we follow up with that physician to say, were you able to help, this mother? Were you able to talk to this young lady? How can what are the questions that you have? What are the challenges? Maybe cultural competency, maybe lack of understanding some of the issues they're bringing, so that we can be able to help you provide better services for them.
Thank you, Zainab. We will now have a questions and answers period. We see that there are some questions up there. I'll start with one that I just saw come up. Are there procedures that can make the FGMC reversible? Dr. Green, do you want to answer that?
Sorry, can you say it one more time? Are there procedures to make it reversible?
Yes.
Yes. So I do not perform those procedures, but I will send young women, if anyone was infibulated, then we do send people to gynecology. Usually I will have a discussion with them as teens about, would you like to have this opened so that you can have an easier time with first intercourse, and we will send people to gynecology prior to marriage if that's of interest to them. Otherwise, it's often done in second trimester just to prevent complications of delivery, because it can cause increased need for C-sections and trouble with birth. So I will refer people to gynecology, ideally to try to have those things corrected prior to marriage and prior to having children. But some people will have it done at a later time.
Thank you. This question from the screen. I understand that today's presentation is female gender specific. However, these cultural rites of passage are also include penile subincision. Are there U.S. laws addressing this as well? Kathleen?
The reason that we're talking about this practice is because, and one of the reasons we're talking about it is because, in fact, there is a federal and there are state laws which prohibit female genital mutilation / cutting, but there are no federal or state laws prohibiting male circumcision. And as the participants have discussed in the chat box, there are certainly some studies which establish that there are some health benefits to male circumcision, and male circumcision certainly doesn't have the consequences that Dr. Green talked about that women experience with FGMC. So I think those are important to point out. One thing I might point you to is there is a recent podcast with This American Life where a young woman discusses FGMC. She had FGMC performed on her when she was a young girl, and she discusses the consequences of it. I think it's highly informative, and it will give you a real sense of how the effects of FGMC on a young girl. So I highly recommend that as well.
And this is Suzanne. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andrea.
No, so I was just going to say the benefits of male circumcision. It is a very cultural practice as well, and it's done less and less now in the U.S., but it has been shown to decrease the risk, very small decrease in the risk of contracting HIV and in getting urinary tract infections. So boys who are uncircumcised in this country who get frequent urinary tract infections, the treatment actually is to circumcise those boys.
And this is Suzanne. I'll just add that while I haven't heard of penile subincision being a big issue in the United States, if there is ever violence against someone, there are other statutes besides FGM, and there are state statutes as well that criminalize child abuse, assault, and any kind of maiming, that kind of thing. So if it does involve some kind of injury or violence to an individual, then it still would be illegal based on those statutes.
Thank you all. How can the government regulate the cases where families are taking their daughters outside the country to get this done?
So I'll address that. First of all, I would like to say we don't have any reported cases of transporting girls out of the country yet. So the law is clear on that. And what the government is regulating or criminalizing is the transport with the intent to perform FGMC. So that the act of transporting or beginning the transport is conduct that occurs here in the United States, and that therefore gives us jurisdiction over the intent to transport. We do not, as I said earlier, have jurisdiction over actual cutting overseas. So there's a distinction there.
Thank you. Who is mandated to report, and if someone has already come to this country having had FGMC done, do you have to report that, or only if it happens afterwards?
So I think this goes to the state laws for mandatory reporting, and also the child abuse laws for mandatory reporting. Those are all state laws, and they are very specific, and they differ in particular ways. So I would point individuals who want to know about mandatory reporting to the state laws or to General Counsel's Office of those Child Protective Services agencies responsible for enforcing those laws.
Thanks. So the only way we are currently identifying these girls at risk are if they are involved with Immigration or Border Patrol. Is that correct?
And I can speak to that one. And it might have been because I was trying to provide an example of how the U.S. is trying to enforce these cases, but really identifying the girls is coming from everywhere. So it's coming from any kind of leads. As I mentioned, we've had a parent call who said that they were afraid that their husband would send their child overseas. And we've had, we also have medical practitioners who may see this, educators who may see it, and really even concerned neighbors or friends. So where the actual identifying of the girls is coming is really from communities themselves, and not necessarily from Immigration and Border Patrol, because they're really seeing kind of the border of our country, whether it's an airport or a land border. And then I'll also add that, and this kind of goes to one of the other questions, that we have received reports that it is happening in this country, and that we do investigate any reliable information about it happening in this country. That there's been a lot of talk about sending girls overseas, and that that definitely happens, and it sounds like that might possibly happen more often. It's really kind of unclear at this point with the information we have, but that there's also information that's happening in the United States, and that's where ICE and FBI and DOJ, local police would all be involved in investigating those cases.
Thank you so much. Has the Justice Department ever prosecuted a case under the federal FGM laws?
So there's one reported case that was investigated under the federal FGM law. It involved a business in California. It was also a tattoo and a piercing business, but two individuals who were running that business advertised that they were performing FGMC. The FBI ran a sting operation, and they reached an agreement with the business owners, meeting of the minds, where the FBI agents, undercover agents, indicated that they had two young children and they wanted them cut. The business owners agreed to do it for a certain amount of money, but certainly there was no cutting, and the two individuals were arrested and charged. Eventually pled guilty, and they did not plead guilty actually to the FGMC charge, but they pled guilty to other charges, including conspiracy, obscenity, and those sorts of charges. So it's the only reported case in the United States. It was investigated again under the FGMC, but it ended up resolving itself under other criminal statutes.
Thank you. How do agencies get around HIPAA laws? Dr. Green, do you want to take that one?
We abide by HIPAA laws, but when there is a danger to a child, then as mandatory reporters, we are not held to that. So in general, confidentiality is kept except for when a child, there's going to be harm done to that child, or that child is threatening harm to someone else. And so those are the times that you can break confidentiality. So if they're harming themselves, or harm is going to be done to them in this kind of based on sort of the child abuse statute, then we can break that confidentiality.
Great, thank you for that clarification. If you have one piece of advice for professionals or anyone who may have contact with a victim of FGMC, what would it be?
Sure, this is Suzanne. I'll go first, but I'm sure everyone will have something. I would just echo what Andrea and Zainab and Kathleen have all talked about, which is really establishing trust and showing that whether it is a family, whether it's a girl, whether it's even a husband as well, because men also have a really important role to play, that we are first and foremost here to protect girls, to try to prevent this, and also that we are, whatever professional, whether medical, educator, that we're on their side and we're trying to help them through it, trying to help them explain whatever medical complications might have already been done, that kind of thing. So really kind of establishing the trust and the relationship, even if it's law enforcement as well, because that is a really key part to what we do.
Yeah, I would echo that. Depending on how the victim relates to they're experiencing this. There are some victims who are really, really upset and get really angry, and so with that kind of a victim is to build up their emotional health and to assure them that they're okay and that you as a provider, you are there to support and help them, and that expressing that anger is also okay. Versus a victim who may have no feeling whatsoever, and you can also, assure them that whatever feeling, even if they don't have any feeling about the practice, is also okay. Versus maybe a victim who's a young girl, who is trying to come to terms with having gone through this and not knowing how to feel about it. So it depends on how that person in front of you is presenting. But you, as a provider, you should always be there to create a safe space for them, to be the person that they can talk to, and also be the person that can also support them, regardless of what kind of emotional reaction they express or they, express. Sometimes they could be angry towards you as well.
And this is Andrea, and I would echo what everyone else is saying, and I would add the importance of understanding where, whoever you're speaking with or about, where are they coming from? Why is it important to them? Really try and understand what is the reason that they feel this is important. And then I feel like you have the ability, once you understand why they want that circumcision to happen in their child, you can understand why and how to maybe be able to counsel them on the importance of not doing it and how to address their concerns above and beyond it just being against the law. So, for me, it's often issues around how do I keep my child chaste? I'm so concerned. There's naked people everywhere on the television. People don't wear very much clothing. Everybody seems so promiscuous. I think all the other kids at high school are having sex. I don't want my child to have sex. And they're really, really concerned. And so really sort of handling that piece of it, or the family pressure they're getting from people back home. And then if they've experienced it, talking about sexuality, talking about things that often are taboo in cultures, creating that trust and relationship so that you can talk about, perhaps understanding why it was done to them and what they are experiencing as a result, and how to support them in their reproductive life, in their sexual life, in their self-image, so that they can heal as best as possible from the trauma they've experienced or the trauma they haven't experienced, but the complications that they might experience as a result of having had this done.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Someone asked if there's any data as to what the most common age is that any of these procedures are being done to girls, and the most common age is 9 years old. No, I think Kathleen. Oh, Kathleen, do you want to?
I think that the evidence shows that certainly this procedure is done before marriage. Oftentimes it's done at infancy. The most prevalent age we've found is between the ages of 5 and 7 years old, actually. So
yeah, I would say that's true in my practice as well. It's 5 to 7-year-olds as well.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll be wrapping up now. This concludes our webinar today. I want to thank the audience and our presenters. I will now turn the webinar back over to Carissa.
Thank you. Thanks, Steffi. I would also like to thank our presenters for a great discussion on this topic. We have just a few brief reminders. This webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. For more information, please contact OJJDP NTTAC or NTTAC. And lastly, please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.
thank you all.